What if a single moment of vulnerability unleashed a secret so powerful that it threatened to unravel everything you held dear? That night, I didn't just unlock a door, I unleashed something far more dangerous, a truth I'd been burying for years. When my stepson, Daniel, unexpectedly intervened, it set into motion a chain of events that neither of us could control. It was one of those evenings when the house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of your own thoughts. The rain pattered softly against the windows, a soothing rhythm that contrasted with the storm brewing inside me. My husband, Ethan, was away again, off on another one of his endless business trips. I had grown used to his absence over the years, but that night, the loneliness felt sharper, more relentless. The warm glow of the lamps in the living room did little to fill the emptiness. I poured myself a glass of wine, rich and deep crimson, and retreated to my room, seeking solitude. I told myself I needed the space to unwind, to breathe, but in truth, I was restless, aching for something I couldn't quite name. I had just started to relax, letting the wine's warmth spread through me, when I heard a faint sound outside my door. My heart jumped. I dismissed it as the creak of the old house settling or the wind rattling the frame. But then it came again, quieter, more deliberate. "Claire," a voice called softly, hesitant but close. It was Daniel, my stepson. Panic gripped me. Earlier, he'd mentioned going out with friends, and I had no reason to think he'd return so soon. I scrambled to regain composure, fumbling for the remote to turn off the TV. My hands betrayed me, trembling as the sound from the screen seemed deafening in the silence. Before I could respond, the door creaked open. I hadn't locked it. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of shock and confusion. For a moment, neither of us moved. The dim light from the TV flickered, casting shadows across his face. My mind raced for an excuse, something to defuse the situation, but no words came. I thought you might be hurt," he stammered, his voice trailing off as his gaze darted between me and the room around me. Embarrassment burned through me, hot and unrelenting. "I'm fine," I managed, my voice shaky. "I didn't expect anyone to be home." Daniel lingered for a moment longer, as though trying to read something in my face. Then, with an awkward nod, he stepped back, pulling the door shut behind him. As soon as I was alone, I sank into the nearest chair, my pulse racing. But it wasn't fear that gripped me, it was something deeper, something I didn't want to name. Over the next few days, I avoided Daniel as much as possible, retreating to the garden or busying myself with chores whenever I heard his footsteps. But he didn't seem content to let the discomfort linger. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes under the warm stream of water, he appeared in the doorway. "Claire," he said softly, leaning against the frame. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry about the other night. I didn't mean to intrude." I kept my gaze fixed on the soapy water, my hands working mechanically. "It's fine," I replied quickly. I should have locked the door. There was a pause, the silence stretching between us. "You seemed upset," he ventured. "Are you okay?" The question caught me off guard. It had been years since anyone asked me that with genuine concern. Ethan rarely noticed my moods, his attention perpetually divided between work and the next trip on his calendar. "I'm fine," I said, the words coming out too quickly. Then, softening, I added, "But thank you for asking." Daniel nodded but didn't leave. His presence filled the small kitchen, and I felt a subtle shift in the air, something unspoken but undeniable. In the weeks that followed, Daniel and I developed an unexpected rhythm. He was more attentive than Ethan had ever been, offering to help with small tasks, bringing in groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or simply sitting with me on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine on the back deck, he asked a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you ever feel lonely, Claire?" The words hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortably direct. I hesitated, my glass frozen halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" "Well," he said, his tone gentle but probing, "Ethan's away so much, and it seems like you don't have a lot of people to talk to." I bristled at the suggestion, but deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. That's not true, I muttered defensively, but my voice lacked conviction. Daniel held my gaze, unflinching. I just mean, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. Or, if you just need company. His honesty disarmed me. It wasn't pity. There was something else in his tone, something genuine. Late one night, I came downstairs to grab a glass of water and found Daniel sitting in the living room, the faint glow of the TV illuminating his face. He looked up as I entered, his expression softening. Couldn't sleep? He asked. I shook my head. No. You. Same, he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Want to join me? I hesitated but eventually sat down, the silence between us comfortable at first. Then he turned off the TV, leaning forward with an intensity that made my breath catch. Claire, he began, his voice low and steady. We need to talk about the other night. My stomach tightened, and I shook my head. No, we don't. But he pressed on. I can't stop thinking about it, he admitted, his words hanging in the air like a confession. The storm outside was relentless, its thunderous roars shaking the old windows of the house. I lit a few candles, their soft glow casting flickering shadows across the room. The electricity was out, and the house felt eerily quiet, save for the rain hammering against the roof. I had settled onto the couch, a book in hand, trying to find solace in the stillness. The silence didn't last long. Claire? Daniel's voice echoed up the staircase, barely audible over the storm. Are you okay up there? I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat before I called back. I'm fine. Just trying not to trip over anything. Moments later, a flashlight beam illuminated the darkened stairwell, and Daniel appeared, his expression soft but curious. The power company said it might be a few hours, he said, his voice low. Mind if I hang out up here? I hesitated again, unsure if I wanted company in the charged atmosphere the storm had created. But his presence felt oddly comforting. Sure, I replied, as long as you don't mind the candles. He grinned, stepping into the room. Better than sitting alone in the dark. We ended up on the living room floor, a single blanket draped across us to ward off the chill. Daniel had brought a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, and its warmth was a welcome counterpoint to the storm outside. The conversation started light, filled with casual remarks about the weather and the unreliable power grid. But then, as the rain intensified, so did his questions. Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you weren't here? He asked, his voice steady but probing. I frowned, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. What do you mean? If you hadn't married Ethan? If you weren't stuck in this house all the time? The question hit harder than I expected. I don't feel stuck, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression both knowing and concerned. Don't you? Ethan's never here, and you don't seem happy. I just think you deserve more than this. His words cut through me like a blade. I wanted to correct him, to insist that I was perfectly content with my life. But as I opened my mouth, the truth spilled out instead. I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. Sometimes, I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices. But, does it matter? This is my life. Daniel leaned closer, his gaze intense but gentle. It doesn't have to be, he said quietly. The air between us grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension that had been building for weeks. When his hand brushed against mine, I froze. I should have pulled away, stopped whatever was happening. But I didn't. In the days that followed, Daniel and I found ourselves drawn to each other in ways we couldn't or wouldn't explain. Our interactions became more frequent, more personal. We found excuses to leave the house together, a trip to the farmer's market here, a hike on a secluded trail there. It wasn't just the thrill of being together, it was the way he listened when I spoke, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. One afternoon, we ended up at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The place was nearly empty, and we sat in a corner booth, our knees brushing beneath the table. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, I said, stirring my coffee absently. Daniel tilted his head, studying me. Why do you say that? I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. This isn't who I am, I said finally. I'm not the kind of person who does this. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. Maybe you are, he said softly. Maybe you just didn't know it until now. But life rarely allows secrets to remain hidden. One evening, as I returned from the grocery store, I found Alice, Daniel's ex-girlfriend, waiting in the living room. Her arms were crossed, her expression cold and calculating. "You're lying," she said, her gaze darting between me and Daniel. "I can see it all over your face." "Alice," I said, forcing calm into my voice, "you're being ridiculous." "Oh, I don't think so," she replied, her tone dripping with venom. "I've seen the way you look at each other. Do you really think you can keep this a secret?" My heart pounded, but I refused to let her see me falter. "You're mistaken," I said evenly. "And I think it's time for you to leave." Alice's smile widened, sharp and cruel. "Oh, I'll leave. But this isn't over." After Alice left, Daniel and I sat in silence, the weight of her threat hanging over us like a storm cloud. "She knows," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She doesn't have proof," Daniel replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "It doesn't matter," I said. "She's not going to let this go." Daniel reached for my hand, his grip firm but reassuring. "We'll figure it out," he promised. But the weight of guilt was becoming unbearable. Every time I saw Ethan's face on a video call, every time I thought about the life I was risking, it became harder to justify what we were doing. Alice's presence loomed over us, her sharp instincts and boldness making her a dangerous adversary. Daniel believed ignoring her would make her go away. I knew better. "It's just talk," he assured me one evening, his arm draped casually over the back of the couch. "It's not just talk," I snapped, pulling away. "You didn't see her face when she left." She knew. The confrontation came to a head when Alice demanded $50,000 for her silence. We couldn't pay her, and even if we could, I knew she'd come back for more. Desperate, I turned to my closest friend, Rachel, for help. "Claire," she said slowly, her tone heavy with disbelief. "Do you understand what you've gotten yourself into?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said, tears welling up. "It just happened." Rachel sighed, her sharp mind already at work. "Alice is a problem, but she's not invincible. There has to be something we can use against her." Rachel uncovered Alice's trail of unpaid debts and a recent brush with the law. Armed with this information, we arranged a meeting in a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. When Alice arrived, her confidence was palpable, but it didn't last long. Rachel slid a folder across the table, its contents wiping the smugness from Alice's face. "This isn't over," Alice hissed as she stormed out. Alice's departure should have been a relief, but it left behind a lingering tension. Ethan came home early, his presence adding to the pressure. One evening, as we sat in the living room, he looked at me closely and asked, "Is there something going on?" The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and whisper of doubt. Aaron's icy words echoed in my mind. "Don't bother calling me until you're ready to tell me the truth." I sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at my phone, willing it to ring, but Aaron hadn't answered my calls in days. The weight of his absence pressed down on me, and for the first time, I began to understand the full magnitude of what had been lost. When Dominic arrived later that evening, his concern was written all over his face. As he stepped through the door, his arms enveloped me in a warm embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling as I clung to him. For a moment, his presence eased the ache in my chest, but the damage had already been done. Dominic stayed with me that night, his calm presence a welcome reprieve from the chaos swirling in my mind. We sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold between us as we tried to piece together our next steps. "Alice has ruined everything," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Aaron's convinced I've been lying to him. I don't know how to fix this." Dominic's jaw tightened. "She's not going to win," he said firmly. "We'll figure something out." But his words, as comforting as they were meant to be, couldn't erase the reality of our situation. Aaron's doubt had become a chasm, one I wasn't sure I could bridge. Just as we thought things couldn't get worse, Alice made her final, devastating move. She showed up at Aaron's office unannounced, armed with just enough of the story to plant seeds of doubt in his mind. She didn't have hard evidence, but her insinuations were enough to stir the embers of suspicion into a raging fire. When I returned home from running errands that afternoon, Aaron was waiting for me in the living room. His expression was cold, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat, my hands trembling as I clasped them in my lap. "Alice came to see me," he began, his voice low but charged with emotion. "She told me everything, or at least enough to make me question what you've been telling me." "Aaron, she's lying," I said quickly, desperation creeping into my tone. "Is she?" he snapped, his eyes narrowing. "Because it's starting to feel like everyone is lying to me." The room was thick with tension, the silence stretching unbearably as his words sank in. Finally, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm leaving," he said, his tone final. "Don't bother calling me until you're ready to tell me the truth." And with that, he was gone. The house felt unbearably empty without Aaron. The quiet was oppressive, a constant reminder of the fracture that now defined my life. Dominic came over often in the days that followed, his presence a small comfort amidst the chaos. But even as we tried to hold on to each other, the weight of what had happened hung heavy between us. One evening, as we sat on the porch, the cool night air wrapping around us, Dominic broke the silence. "We can't keep living like this," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know," I said softly, "but I don't know how to move forward." "We have to face this," he said, turning to look at me. "No more running, no more hiding. We need to figure out what we want and fight for it." His words struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I had been caught in a cycle of avoidance and denial, afraid to confront the truth of my feelings and the consequences of my actions. But Dominic was right, it was time to face the storm head-on. With the help of my friend Rachel, who had been a steady source of support throughout this ordeal, we began to devise a plan. Alice's reign of terror needed to end, and the truth, however painful, needed to come to light. Rachel's sharp instincts and relentless determination uncovered more about Alice's past, a trail of manipulations and deceit that painted a clear picture of her true intentions. Armed with this information, we set out to confront her one final time. The meeting took place in a small cafe on the edge of town, its quiet atmosphere a stark contrast to the tension bubbling beneath the surface. Alice arrived late, her smug demeanor barely masking her unease. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," she said as she slid into the seat across from me. "This ends now," I said, sliding a folder of documents across the table. Alice's confident facade cracked as she flipped through the contents, her expression darkening with each page. "You're playing a dangerous game," she hissed, her tone laced with venom. "No, Alice," I said calmly. "You are. And it's over." With Alice out of the picture, the immediate threat was neutralized, but the damage she had caused couldn't be undone. Aaron didn't return home that night, or the next. The silence was deafening, each passing day a painful reminder of the fractures that had formed in our lives. Dominic and I knew we couldn't go back to the way things were, but we also couldn't deny the connection that had brought us together. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the porch where we sat, I turned to Dominic, his presence steady and reassuring. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. And in that moment, I believed him. The storm that had threatened to destroy us had passed, but the scars it left behind would take time to heal. Aaron's absence was a constant ache, a reminder of the life I had built and the choices that had unraveled it. But as I sat on that porch, the cool night air wrapping around me like a promise of renewal, I knew one thing for certain. Life had changed forever, and while the path ahead was unclear, it was mine to shape.